Welcome, everyone, to the 8th episode of the PlainGains podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the squats versus hip thrust study, and I'm back with Juan. So why don't you go ahead and introduce the study and kind of tell us what it's all about?
Yeah, so from what I understand, the study was funded by Brett Contreras, the glute guy, and Menno Henselman. I think that's how I pronounce his last name. Menno Henselman. And they funded it themselves. I think they used up like 80K of their own money because MRI was like $600 the hour, which is insane.
Yeah.
So, huge respect for them. I think this is a pretty well done study. At least the best one so far that has been done, because there was one done by an author from Brazil. I forgot his name, and I think it started with a B, but it was very spectacle, and he has a lot of research papers that like even the researchers and scientists were like, we can't trust this guy. So this is like the first official study or well done study that was done, and it was done at Auburn, which is, I believe, is the most popular lab or really good lab when it comes to resistance training. And essentially what this study went over was squats and hip thrust. And what they did was, I believe it was, once one group did squats and then the other group did hip thrust. I'm not entirely sure how many. I don't know if it was like squats was like n equals 11, and then hip thrust was like n equals like 24. Not entirely sure. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but essentially they did. The frequency was 2 times a week, and they went on for a total of 9 weeks, and then sets were gradually increased during the weeks. Progressive overload was added. So week 1 was 3 sets, I believe. Week 2 was 4 sets. Week 3 to 6 was 5 sets, and then week 7 to 9 was 6 sets. Again, 2 times a week. And what they found was that the hip thrust and the squats elicited very similar hypertrophy for the glutes. Now, they did see a significant growth for the glutes, which is good. So that means both exercises are great glute builders. But the differences were very minor. I think the hip thrust, when we talk about numbers, did statistically do a little better than the squats when it comes to the glute training.
By statistically, do you mean like marginally better, not statistically significantly better?
Yeah, marginally better.
Yeah, okay. So not statistically significant, but if you look at the actual number, it's slightly higher.
Yes, I believe so. Now, notable, like enough to make notable gains? No, I don't think so. It was just, they both elicit very similar glute gains. And so we wanted to talk about the study itself and maybe some limitations or maybe some things that we kind of could bring up, because a really popular thing right now is like, oh, well, the glutes and the hip thrust or the squats, are lengthened by a glute movement, but we didn't see more glute growth. So what does that say about, different theories going around and like if the glutes respond better to shortened position movements? So I kind of just want to go over all these stuff. I think it'll be pretty fun.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I do want to add was I'm pretty sure all of those sets were taken to failure, just so that was consistent. That's not one of the confounding variables here. All the sets were taken to failure.
I'm glad you brought that up. It was I think it was volitional failure. So they kept going, and that's another problem. It's pretty vague. That's pretty vague. So volitional failure is like they keep going until they cannot perform the rep with perfect form. I believe
I thought it's volitional failure is, if it's volitional failure, that would be when the participant wants to stop. Concentric failure is when you can no longer perform the rep with the correct technique.
It was that one.
Okay, so it's concentric failure.
I think they used volition. I think they used volitional failure or something like that.
But
I know they stopped. I know they check. But I know they stopped when they say failure, but if I remember correctly in the study, they stopped when they couldn't perform the concentric rep with proper form, or just the rep with proper form. I don't know if you want to check it real quick just to make sure.
Yeah, I'm looking. Was Contreras the lead author?
No, it was.
It was Daniel. Yeah,
it was Daniel.
Yeah. All right.
and hopefully we could
Method.
bring him on soon.
Yeah,
That's
that'd
the
be
plan.
great. I need to look at the full text. Go to methods. Participants assigned to one of two groups: back squat and hip thrust, and then 72 hours following the last training bout. Okay.
Does it just say failure? Is it like a type of failure?
I'm trying to find it. It's not. This is all about measuring strength and hypertrophy here.
Well, as you look for
MRI.
that, I'm just going to explain to the people
Yeah, go for it.
watching that I also want to bring up the fact that I believe the participants, only four of them went ass to grass, so like all the way to the bottom, and then the majority of them were squatted to parallel. I've been hearing a lot of like debates around that. I know there was one participant who was like 6'8", extremely tall. I think he squatted a little bit above parallel. But I was hearing that it's like, oh wait, no, the majority of people squatted ass to grass, and only a couple squatted to parallel. But now I'm hearing only four squatted ass to grass. I think in the paper it said that the majority squatted to parallel.
Okay, so you're right. It says volitional muscular failure, which they define as participants being unable to volitionally perform another concentric repetition while maintaining the proper form. So it is volitional failure as I defined it, which basically means that the people stop when it hurts too much that they don't want to do another rep or they don't
And
think they can do another rep. They didn't actually go and fail another rep
and
after that.
that's another thing we should bring up when we talk about the limitations, but we'll bring that up later on.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess we could start off first with maybe some like our thoughts before the study. Like, what do you think of squats as a glute builder? Like, did you ever use them for building your glutes? Have you ever done hip thrusts? Do you think they're a necessity?
So, yeah, so I think that I guess my opinion hasn't really changed, but prior to um, reading this paper, I'm basically in the camp of squats can be a good glute builder for some people, but not all people. For example, I'm one of those people where squats don't build the glutes at all. I've done hundreds and hundreds of barbell back squats, ass to grass, good technique, high load, high RPE, but I did not see glute growth doing that. Now, why is this probably the case? Well, I have short femurs and I have a super quad dominant squat. So it's like not even close that my quads are going to be the limiting factor every single time. So I've honestly never felt my glutes a single time in a regular barbell back squat. Um, so for me, if I was to choose barbell back squats or hip thrusts for my personal self as a glute builder, I would have chosen hip thrusts just because I actually get glute stimulus out of it as opposed to the barbell back squats, which I haven't really seen any glute growth with. In fact, if people are like, oh, well, sensation doesn't mean causation, whatever, I've done the trial run where I've done barbell back squats for years and years and years, seen no glute growth. And then I started training my glutes directly with hip thrusts, and I had tremendous glute growth in the first 3 months. So it's definitely a thing there. Now, that's not to say that squats are not a good glute builder for everybody. People that have a more hip dominant squat can definitely get tremendous glute growth from their squats. Now, if I was performing squats to be a more glute bias movement, I think I would get a lot of glute out of it, but I was doing it as quad bias, and I think that that's not really a great glute exercise. But for someone with super long femurs and they end up looking more like this at the bottom as opposed to like this at the bottom, so their body's like that, so more hip flexion, less knee flexion versus lots of knee flexion, not that much hip flexion, you might get a lot more glutes out of it, and you could definitely see some tremendous growth. I don't know if
Are
you
you,
have
are
any.
you saying are you saying people with more knee flexion will get more glute growth?
No, so well, I don't think glute growth is really dependent on knee flexion because the glutes are not obviously attached to the knees. Um, there might be some situations where higher knee flexion allows you to get deeper hip flexion, which then supports more glute growth. But I'm saying that people that have more quad dominant squats, so they're like very vertical torso, lots of knee flexion, less hip flexion. Definitely, you can't really squat deep without hip flexion, but less hip flexion and having the movement be really knee dominant as opposed to hip dominant, you're going to get a little bit more quads. Whereas if you got a hip dominant squat, you get a lot of glutes. Like you'll see some professional athletes or whatever, and they're squatting to parallel, and they've got like a super hip dominant squat, and their glutes are ridiculously massive. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think they have a hip dominant squat and it's causing their glutes to grow, or their glutes are huge, so they're using their glutes to have a hip dominant squat so they can lift more weight. So it's one
Yeah,
or the other.
and that's another thing. The person's anthropometry also matters. So like how their structure is built. But I also want to bring up the fact that your a person's, I guess, moment arms can also change as they uh, build muscle. Like their internal moment arms, or like the leverage of the muscle can actually change as you build muscle. So, for example, there is scenarios, and I think hypertrophy coach and Joe Bennett and Tom Purvis talked about this, where it's theoretical, but it could be true, where people who don't have a big butt and have like a very flat butt and do squats, the leverage of the glutes is like so small that it doesn't really do a lot for the glutes when you squat. So maybe hip thrust will be better for it then. But and then you notice when you have people that do squats that have big glutes, squats become a great glute builder because the leverage of the glutes increase for the squats in that bottom range of hip flexion. It was an interesting video they had about that, so I just thought that was important to bring up. I don't know how much that matters. Again, even they said it's just like an interesting thing to nerd out on. But it was just a cool thing to bring up.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I definitely think that anthropometrics matter a lot here. It's the same reason why some people can get super deep squats because the way their anthropometrics are, their center of mass allows them to get into the deep squat position, whereas other people can't get quite as deep because of where their center of mass is with respect to the length of their femur and the length of their torso. And so I think that also definitely shifts what muscles are going to be dominant in the particular movement, as opposed to something that's basically fixed in place like a hip thrust where you're only moving your hips and I guess a little bit of your knees, but that's not really significant.
Yeah, I mean I've never been one to do hip thrust. I've like I don't think I've ever really programmed hip thrust, at least for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Squats, I would do squats, but I wouldn't really do it for the glutes. I would just do it because I just wanted to get better at squats.
Yeah.
Now, my quads are they could grow pretty easily. I
Mm-hmm.
guess they're one of those muscle groups that like I'm pretty dominant in. Um, and so I kind of had to stop doing squats and like a lot of leg stuff because, um, well, I don't know. I'd never really done squats. I've always been more of a hack squat kind of guy. I fell in love with the hack squat and the
Yeah.
pain. I mean, I hate the pain, but I
Right.
just, I prefer the hack squat more. I feel like the squat, I mean, I guess part of me is just lazy, honestly. It's a difficult movement. It's hard.
No,
It,
definitely.
it is hard. A part of me wants to go into squatting, but that part of me is more like for powerlifting, where it's like, well, maybe let me focus more on my hypertrophy side because it wasn't until recently where I started to like get serious about how I look, just to see how far I could take it. I haven't really been so like serious about that for myself, but now I'm trying to be. And then once I get that hypertrophy stage out the way, then I'll see about going into powerlifting and see, squatting heavy and all that stuff for fun. But I did want to bring up, well, also, I thought it was also pretty cool to bring up the fact that I think girls have a better control over their center of mass than guys do. I remember, I remember seeing something about that, so I'm not
I have
sure
no
that
idea. So I'm just not going to say anything because I have not read any papers on that. Um,
I haven't read papers, but it's something that I've been hearing for a while. There was a test where it's like you have a guy and a girl go on
I
like
saw
Bernese,
that. I saw that.
right?
And I think what that comes from is typically girls have longer legs than guys do, and they store more of their weight in their lower body than guys do. Typically, guys have like bigger, huskier upper bodies. And if you just look at like obese men versus obese women, obese men hold more of their fat in their upper body on average, as opposed to the women in the lower body. And so if your lower body is proportionally longer and heavier than your upper body as a woman, you're going to be able to do that test without falling. Whereas the guy, if you have a proportionally heavier upper body, you're going to fall forward. So I don't know if it's control over your center of mass. That's not really how it works. Um, I don't think you can control your center of mass. Your center of mass is where it is. And like you can
Yeah.
move in different planes of motion to change where like your center of mass is pointing, like it's always pointing down, but like you can move around to change where your center of mass is based off of like where your body is pointing down and stuff. But you can't like control it. The control of your center of mass is coming from you moving in different ways. So I think um,
Uh,
that particular
may,
test comes from weight rather
yeah,
than.
maybe it wasn't like necessarily controlling the center of mass, but it's like maybe some movements are just more biased towards a person's center of mass. I'm not entirely sure how the thing
Well, I
was.
mean,
I don't
on
have
free
no
weight
idea.
movements, definitely, because like how you move in a squat is almost entirely. I mean, obviously, it's possible. Like if you are squatting with really high or really low RPE, you could like move however you want, probably. But if you're squatting with high RPE and lots of load, like you're pretty much only squatting in one way, like at least the downward part. The upward part, yeah, you could like move around. You could do like the shoot your hips up, good morning it up. You could like go up evenly, whatever. But essentially, your squatting, the way it looks, is going to be determined by your anthropometrics, and whether your bar position, I guess. So if you have a high bar, low bar squat.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to read papers on I guess anthropology on I guess the evolution of why guys just tend to have a bigger upper body and girls a bigger lower body or more fat in the lower body for both sides of men and women. I'm not sure if there's like an evolution standpoint on why that happens.
Well, women
But
have to birth children, so it's advantageous to have a larger lower body because they need to
there is,
birth children.
yeah, and I know that comes from monkeys too, because apparently chimpanzees or something, they had a very wide womb and stuff like that. We kind of went over I went over this with my anthropology professor. We were talking about this, and this was in a class like a year ago. He was actually bringing this up on the fact that like it was talking about like chimpanzees in the wombs and how women have to give birth, and that's why different structures of the hips also matter for that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we went into talking about like people in cold weather tend to just have more fat in the body overall. People in hot weather have, I forgot the name of the law of what's it called, but I think it was like Murr's law. I don't know. I have no idea. But
Yeah.
yeah, interesting stuff. Like little tangent, but
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that the whole anthropometry thing is like the main reason why I didn't expect anything. Like if you would have asked me what the results of this study were going to be, if you told me like exactly what the protocol was, I would have probably guessed that they would have similar, or the hip thrusts would do slightly better. And that's just based off of my own bias that squats don't grow my glutes at all. But I have plenty of clients where squats do grow their glutes, so that's why I would have guessed like probably similar. And I did hear the lead author. I think he was saying that not a lot of the participants were squatting to parallel or like very deep. They were getting shallow. Some of them obviously were squatting deeper, but not everyone was. So that's gonna be one limitation there.
yeah, and I think we could start bringing up the limitations on that. These were untrained participants. They weren't trained people. And they chose, and I think they both have pros and cons. I think a really big strength in the untrained participants is that there's no bias to any exercise. So it's really good for seeing results. It's really good for just seeing a difference in results. Because if you have trained participants, they could have a bias towards one exercise over the other, depending their situation and how they trained in the past. Um, Also, but a small what could be considered a small limitations for untrained people is that the squat is a very difficult movement, and to learn it in the span of 9 weeks, or not even then, probably even before they'd have to learn it, is not it's not easy. Like the hip thrust is a very easy movement, at least easier than the squat, I believe, and there's theories suggesting that these untrained individuals were more in the what's known as the neural phase, just like teaching their body to respond to this movement, to the squat. And then they hypothesized that if the study went on for longer, or if they choose train individuals or whatever, they'd be more in the hypertrophic phase. that they'd already get the benefit of the squat because their body could already respond to that. I mean, there are people who've been squatting their entire life and are still learning how to squat. I don't know how big of a limitation that is. I still think 9 weeks was a good amount. Better if it went on for longer, I wouldn't complain. But I mean, the majority of resistance training studies usually last around 9 weeks.
Yeah, so I actually think it's a pretty big limitation, but not necessarily because of the reason that they were going through the neural phase. I think it's more so the fact that untrained individuals don't have experience pushing themselves to actual failure. And so because they were doing volitional failure where they're stopping, where they don't think they can perform another concentric rep with proper form, these untrained individuals are not going to be as good at telling, especially on a complex movement like the squat, where like you could keep going for a really long time by just shifting your movement a little bit. Like maybe you're a really knee dominant squatter and your quads get tired, and then you can then like shift it into a good morning and you could keep going for a long time. And you'll see that when you're looking at like a power lifter that's less experienced do like a max rep set, for example. You'll see their technique looks really, really good in the beginning, and then eventually they shift it a little bit, even if it's not that noticeable to the visual eye. They're shifting it so something else is taking over and can allowing them to continue. But it's definitely something that's extremely physically demanding, and it makes you want to stop a lot earlier than in a hip thrust. Like if you're doing a set of 12, which the rep range was 8 to 12 of squats, like that is way harder than a set of 8 to 12 on a hip thrust, just like for your overall body. So that's definitely
Yeah,
something to consider there, that the people doing hip thrusts were most likely training at least a little bit closer to failure than the squats group.
yeah, and that's important to bring up that the squat is a very painful exercise, and they did have safety bars, and I think they had like 3 people, um, protect or I guess keeping
Spotting.
eye or coaching, spotting, on the participants. But regardless, I don't think I've ever met anyone in my life that was able to take a squat to failure, like to actual failure, other than Tom Platz. I've never met in my life, but I've never seen anyone take a squat to actual failure. And taking a hip thrust to failure does seem, I mean, using common sense, does seem to be easier than the squat just because the squat has a lot more limiting factors. And it's just like the cognitive demand on the squat is pretty heavy. So yeah, that could be that the participants in the squats probably, or like even though what was it, volume was equated, was the I guess the quality of the volume, could it really be correlated to each other, equal with each other? Because if you get the quality of the volume of hip thrust taken to failure versus the quality of the volume of the squats taken to failure, I think there's like a difference in that. I'm having trouble like picking up words today.
That's okay. I know exactly what you mean, and there's absolutely a huge difference. And that's one thing I wanted to bring up was the number of sets was actually pretty high. If you take a look at like towards the end when they were
I
doing
think it was 8 to 12. I think it was
that
eight
was
to
reps,
12.
that's reps. Yeah.
Oh,
Sets. So the
sets
number,
was
yeah,
six. Yes, you're right.
yeah. So the sets being like even 4 sets, like okay, 3 sets of squats, 2 sets of squats, that's like pretty normal, I would say. A majority of people can go in and they can get some pretty productive sets if they're attempting to take 2 to 3 sets of squats to failure. Those sets are going to be reasonably effective, probably. But if you're extending that to 4, 5, 6 sets in a session of squats, there's very, very low chance, especially because they're beginners, that those fourth, fifth, and sixth sets were productive at all. Like I know myself, if I went in there after 2 sets of squats to failure, I'm absolutely fried. There's zero chance I'm getting anything out of any further sets of squats. And it's not just my quads are fried or whatever. It's my whole body is fried and I don't want to move anymore. And of course, these participants are new, so they're not going to be able to get to that level of failure. But it's definitely something to consider is that the amount of volume that's real volume, not junk volume, is probably going to be higher in the hip thrust group because it's just not as demanding of a movement in any capacity as a squat would be.
Yeah, from a practical standpoint, 6 sets of squats is like insane.
Yeah,
Like unless you're doing powerlifting, and even then, powerlifters still stay like I think 1 to 3 reps in reserve sometimes when doing
Yeah,
that
most of
many
them are
sets.
pretty far from failure. Like if you're doing 6 sets, it's probably like volume work, and you're probably using a low percentage of your 1 rep max and just training for technique pretty much.
Yeah, so I mean, the question could arise if the sets and the reps were likely comparable with each other, and I honestly don't think they were that comparable.
Yeah,
Uh, I could very clearly see the argument that squats or the quality of the reps for squats and the quality of the volume for squats could be very much different from that of the hip thrust. And that's not the researcher's fault. Um, but it's just like, again, it's just taxing. I mean, it's conducting the study is hard. I'm not saying like, oh, they could do better. Like, I'm pretty sure this was already like a complicated study to deal with.
super
Having the
complicated.
participants having the participants do their best into squatting a good depth. Like, it's not easy to conduct a study, so it's like you can't just like tell the researchers like, oh, why didn't you just do this? Like, if they didn't do it, then it's probably a reason why they couldn't do it. Maybe they wish they did, but they just couldn't. Or there was just so many other factors to come into play that they couldn't just pick one thing without ignoring all the others. So
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point there. And I just think that, like personally, if no hate to the researchers, I know this is like a question that everyone wants answered, is like, should I squat or should I hip thrust? And I agree with their conclusion that it doesn't have to be binary one or the other. It can be both. It can be a combination of both. And I think a combination of both is probably going to afford you better results because you're able to get productive volume out of both the hip thrusts and the squats if you separate it properly. Because I'm telling you, if you do 6 sets of squats, you're not going to be getting productive volume out of all 6 of those sets. Perhaps the hip thrust, maybe, but even that, like more than 4 sets of hip thrust for me is a lot. Maybe some people, beginners, they might be able to get a little bit more because they can't actually take their sets to real failure. They can't recruit as many motor units, so the actual set to failure is not going to be as daunting. But it's still quite a lot of sets. Now, I think a really interesting follow up study to this, if we wanted to answer more of the long versus short muscle length question without so many confounders like exercises being so much more challenging than another, I think like a single leg hip thrust versus a single leg press, or in the hip thrust have that be in a machine like a Nautilus Nitro or whatever the machine is that everyone uses. That would kind of tease out the long versus short muscle length a little bit better because both of those are not that systemically demanding. And you could do within person study design where you just have one person's one leg do hip thrust and the other person's leg do leg press, and then you just analyze it that way. That way, you'd really be able to tease out the difference between long and short muscle length. Though this would need to be a much longer term study, probably 12 weeks, if you wanted to see differences, because we do know that training one limb affects the size of the other limb. So that's one confounder in that study design.
oh yeah, there's that uh where if you do unilateral training, I think it was, there's that cross education is what they call
Yeah.
it, I think. Where it's like
Yeah.
if you grow one limb, then the body would grow the other one to some degree,
Yeah.
which I think is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
I actually recently read a paper on some of the mechanisms, and it's super complex. It's like we still have no idea why that happens.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to bring, yeah, but again with the volume thing, there was actually a study that did RDLs and leg presses, and then they added RDLs plus the hip thrust, and then that was the group that grew the most.
Yeah.
And they probably, I think, um, believe that that group grew the most because volume probably had a huge part of the role in that. Just because with the hip thrust, you're able to accumulate more volume. And we'll probably talk about why coming up when we bring up the fact that the squat does train the glutes in a more lengthened position, and it has been seen that lengthened bias movements tend to cause more muscle damage. I'm not sure how big of a role that plays in the limitation, um, but that could be something. And muscle damage is higher for untrained individuals. So, and muscles grow better when damage is lower. That's something we've seen in the research. So that's also an interesting thing to bring up.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that goes back on my point, where we want to have multiple exercises that one train the muscle that you're trying to target through either different ranges of motion or different planes of motion or different resistance profiles, because that way we're able to allow our muscle to take volume from a bunch of different places so it doesn't just get destroyed from one particular place and you can't train any other way. So it's kind of like if you do six, it's the reason why people will say you might want to do 3 sets of squats and 3 sets of hip thrusts, and that might produce better growth than 6 sets of squats, even if the squats are technically the set for set better exercise. It's just the fact that you might not be able to get effective volume or effective reps out of 6 sets of squats because it's too fatiguing on the entire body, as opposed to just being locally fatiguing on the glutes.
Yeah, I mean, a person could also make the argument saying, well, I'd rather just perform the productive sets on the exercise that could be more beneficial instead of like splitting it up into two. I mean, I guess it could go both ways. Um,
No,
but
I
again,
think if
that
you're I think if you're doing the product, like if you have a limited time or something like that, it absolutely makes the most sense to do the exercise that's going to produce the most growth for set basis. But again, those exercises are usually going to be more fatiguing. And so if you're looking at maximizing your stimulus to produce the most growth, it might be better. You might end up getting more stimulus by doing 2 separate exercises because you have a finite amount of fatigue that you can have. So, for example, I'll use like an RDL and a lying leg curl. If you do let's say an RDL costs 40 on the fatigue units, and the lying leg curl costs 20 on the fatigue units per set. If you did 3 sets of RDLs, you would have over your maximum fatigue amount. So you'd have 120 fatigue units. Whereas if you did 2 sets of RDLs and then 1 set of lying leg curls, you'd max your fatigue limit, allowing you to maximize your growth. And that would be better than doing just 2 sets of RDLs because you would be leaving some extra stimulus that you could have gotten if you just did a different exercise that had a lower fatigue amount. If that kind of makes sense.
yeah. Um, well, I didn't bring this up when we were talking about the untrained individuals and their, I guess, volitional failure, what they perceive as failure. You also made a video talking about a new study going over that. I think that measured people who are untrained and people who are trained have a similar. Well, they seem to preserve failure in a similar fashion. But I think you had a video going over some of the limitations on that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Which
Yeah, because I
we'll
know
we'll
I know
put up
I've
there.
seen some people. I've seen some people talk about like, oh, but I saw Menno Hanselman's new post, or like somewhat a new post, going over the fact that people who are trained and people who are untrained seem to perceive a similar, um, I guess, range of failure, that they know how to go to failure pretty equally. But again, you said that there's something wrong with that study. There was a couple limitations you went over.
Yeah,
I don't.
there's plenty of limitations there. Um, there's also the fact that resistance trained people, not all of them, obviously. Like if you just gather everyone at your gym and you like look at their average training, they're going to be training way further from failure than they probably would want to be to maximize hypertrophy. But that doesn't mean they don't know how to train to failure. They just might not enjoy the pain, or they might not know that they need to train this close to failure to maximize their growth. So that's one thing to consider. Additionally, I think I don't know if this is really supported. This is kind of my own speculation and my own experience, is that as you become more trained, you can recruit better and higher motor unit levels, or just a more amount of motor units in a given muscle performing a particular movement. And then that means that that single set of that movement is not only going to give you more stimulus, but significantly more fatigue. And so it's kind of like you can just train harder than you can as a novice or whatever. You might both be going to concentric velocity failure where you literally failed the rep, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same level of failure as the novice, because the experienced person could be taking more motor units to failure than the novice person, if you kind of understand what I'm saying there.
Yeah. And the thing with that is that, or well, I like how you brought up the fact that it's not that the people maybe don't know how to train to failure, but it's like they just don't train to failure. I mean, as a coach, I mean, in my experience or as a trainer, when tell somebody to take something to failure just to see, and I usually do this with like my somewhat advanced clients, there's so much more left in the tank. And I don't know if it's the fact that, like you said, it's not that they probably don't know how to train to failure, but it's like they just don't know what it feels like.
Mhm.
So that's why I think training to failure is also an important thing, just for you to get a glimpse of what it's like to be in those last reps, in those dying moments.
Yeah.
So that's also pretty important or that's a reason why you should train to failure. Maybe it's not only to maximize muscle growth, but just to give you a perception on how close you should be going to that point.
Yeah, and I think I've heard Cassim talk about this a lot where um as you get more advanced and you do different exercises, the failure point feels completely different on the different exercises, how experienced you are, how many sets you're doing, where in the workout it is. So kind of changing up when you train to failure, like whether it's an entire session, you train to failure every couple of weeks or whatever, or maybe you take the last set to failure um, on every or on one or two exercises in a given session every single week. Um, that way, you are able to kind of feel the different experiences of failure because I can tell you a set of 25 calf raises to failure feels completely different than a set of 5 dumbbell presses to failure. So it's just something that everyone needs to experience if they're looking to train within a close proximity to failure reliably.
Yeah, and I think I also heard him talk about the fact that like every rep, the strength curve differs.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I know what you're talking about. I have heard him talk about something similar to that. But back to the muscle damage thing on the squats and the hip thrust. Again, I'm not sure how big of a limitation that stands because again, I mean, think about it. It was only 2 times a week they trained,
I
and
mean, that's a
they
lot. Think about it. 12 sets of squats in a week. That's insane. I've never done that in my life. And I've done maybe 8 sets of squats in a week, and I was torched from that if they were to actual failure, which I've done that. I've done let's see, what's probably the most volume I've done back when
Well,
I was
keep in
doing
mind
like
that
2015.
the sets they did increase the sets towards the end, so it's not that they started with the 12 sets of squats.
Oh yeah,
So
if they started with
maybe
that, they'd be done. They'd be toast.
maybe it was to the maybe at the end the damage didn't or the gains could have probably subsided maybe
Yeah,
and the
you're thinking
damage started
the
occurring.
repeated bout effect caused the damage to subside to a significant degree to cause growth. Yeah, I mean it's definitely possible, but I honestly think that damage doesn't play as big of a role purely because I don't think the sets to failure were that close to failure on the squats. I can't imagine that being the case because you'll even see with beginners where you will have them do a set of squats and they will have no concentric velocity decrease and they'll just randomly fail a rep because maybe their knee moved like 2 centimeters to the left and it like caused them to miss groove and just fail. So there's that, and that doesn't mean their quads and glutes are actually like close to muscular failure or whatever. So there's just so many confounders with such a complex movement with beginners, where training to failure is just probably not that feasible of a option.
Yeah, and I think I mean, yeah, and so yeah, I guess it's just either or. I mean, and again, the whole thing with the untrained participants that are more prone to muscle damage than trained individuals. Because again, it's lengthened movements, so even so, it's not just the fact that squats are, or it's not the fact that you're trained to failures that the squats is a lengthened bias movement. I'm not entirely sure. We don't entirely know why lengthened movements cause more muscle damage. I know there's a whole speculation with calcium ion fatigue and all that stuff. I don't think the evidence is concrete on that. I have read some papers from this researcher called Han Jizzle, I think was her name. But I think from the studies that I read, most of the time they just speculate it's just higher intramuscular force in those stretch positions, which could probably be the reason why it damages the fibers more. But yeah, that's again another limitation. Whether it's minor or not, that also depends, like you said, how close to failure these people were training. But that brings us to another limitation, going over the fact that, or somewhat bring up the fact that why we didn't see more glute growth from the squat than the hip thrust of the squat is more lengthened biased.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any theories on that, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it just goes back to what I've been saying. Like, it's a matter of a couple of things. It's a matter of one, the squats definitely were not, okay, I can't say definitely, but we're most likely not taken as close to failure as the hip thrusts were on average. And they were probably further, like maybe even more than 2 RAR left, whereas the hip thrusts were most likely within the range of 2 to 0 RAR. Additionally, the additional sets of squats past maybe 4 were probably junk volume for a majority of these people, meaning they were not productive sets. And that's not to say that you can't do 6 sets of quads or glutes in a given session and that would be junk volume. But 6 sets of one exercise in particular is going to be more likely to be junk volume than if you were to split that up into a couple different exercises. Um, so that's one thing to consider, that not all the 6 sets of squats or necessarily the 6 sets of hip thrusts are going to be productive volume, though it's more likely that the 6 sets of hip thrusts are productive volume because it's less psychologically, physically demanding than the squats. And I think that pretty much covers like why. Oh, also the fact that I'm pretty sure the lead researcher said that not a lot of the participants were squatting super deep. So that's not going to stretch the glutes as much. So really, it's not comparing long, like ultra long to short muscle lengths because the people weren't taking the glutes to very long muscle lengths to begin with.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are speculating now. They immediately jump to the conclusion where it's like, oh well, the adductors have better leverage in the glutes and at the lower at the bottom of the squat. But
Yeah.
again, most of the participants didn't go ass to grass, which is where the adductors seem to have the best leverage. First of all, second of all, again, we pretty much know that just where muscle has the best leverage and where it grows best seem to be two different things. But I also want to bring up the fact that the squat has just many it just has more limiting factors, whether it's the lower back or the quads and maybe the glutes. I mean, if you are taking squats to failure, it's very likely that the quads were the muscles or the main muscles that were taken closest to failure, and the glutes were taken maybe further away from failure than they were supposed to be. So that could be another thing, and that kind of, I think that strengthens the point on how important length and bias movements are, because if the glutes were taken further away from failure than the quads, and they didn't squat all the way ass to grass, and yet the glutes and or yet the squat still managed to elicit similar glute growth to the hip thrust, just pretty much tells you how good of a movement the squat is, or possibly how beneficial the stretch could be in the movement.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I really want to see something that super stretches the glutes, like a single leg press versus a single leg hip thrust, because I think, purely speculation, the single leg press on a per set basis is going to blow the hip thrust out of the water in terms of glute max growth. And now it is interesting because um, a lot of people, and I know Brett Contreras group does this all the time, is they perform, and I think Menno Henselman's done this a lot too with his clients, is they perform a ridiculous number of sets of hip thrusts. Like they do like 40 sets of hip thrusts in a week or whatever, because you can do hip thrusts every single day. You're not going to be sore unless you're like novel to the movement or whatever. So that's one thing to consider is um, it's not necessarily obvious that hip thrusts won't outperform lengthened position movements when you can do significantly more sets. And we really don't know because we don't have any research where it's not volume equated. All of the research is pretty much volume load or volume number of sets equated. And so we don't know if more sets of a less fatiguing movement like hip thrust in a shortened position movement is better than less sets of a lengthened position movement. We just don't know. And I think that would be
Yeah,
really challenging to do, but it's definitely an interesting topic. And it takes us back to the point of the two different camps where you have low volume, high intensity, or high volume, slightly lower intensity.
yeah. So I mean, that's probably how you should be thinking of this instead of jumping into the conclusion where it's like, oh well, the adductors are better leverage, so therefore the glutes didn't grow as much. I mean, again, well, leverage seems to not be a problem as you get close to failure. Either way,
Right.
your body's just going to want to recruit everything it can that could affect the move or the task, or that could perform the task in a positive manner. Um, so, but I mean, even then, if the glutes still have some leverage, it would still probably be able to work. I mean, again, where muscle grows best and where it has the best leverage seem to be two different things. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't. I would. This wasn't the discussion at the bottom of the study where they talked about the leverages and like the neuromechanical matching thing. But they did say it's highly spectacle, and it's just probably not the main reason. It could be, but they said it's just very spectacle.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's the whole like neuromechanical matching model. I think it makes a lot of sense, but at the same time, I think that it can't be necessarily just held to the standard that some people hold it to, where like every single person is going to have the exact same leverage and the exact same motion patterns, because you see differences. Like if you're saying the adductors or whatever have the best leverage at this degree of hip flexion or whatever, the degree of hip flexion for like if you get into, let's just say, 120 degrees of hip flexion or something like that in a squat or whatever, the resulting knee flexion and all of that other stuff affects what muscles are going to be recruited. So I think it's a lot more complex than it initially seems, which is probably why certain people might get a ton of adductor growth out of super deep squats, whereas other people get a ton of glute growth out of super deep squats. And it's dependent on a lot of different factors. And I don't think neuromechanical matching encompasses all of those in one. I could be wrong. Again, I don't know too much about it, but that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm not saying leverage doesn't matter. I mean, you got to like that doesn't mean like, oh, well, just because a muscle can probably produce more force in theory, um, if it has less leverage, that doesn't immediately mean you should be looking for an exercise that puts a muscle in a disadvantageous position. You also have to incorporate the context of, is it the muscle that has the best leverage to perform the task with the muscles around it? Because, like
Yeah,
for example, take the knee joint. That muscle has the best leverage to extend the knee with the muscles around it. Sure, it could have some help, but it's not like there's other muscles that are just better at extending the knee. You know,
yeah,
so there's just things to take into consideration and just look at it from a global perspective. Um, as for the neuromechanical matching thing, again, yeah, it could be. I mean, it has been. It seems to be going on, or it has been seen in what is it? Cardio cardiovascular muscles or cardio muscles, something like
hmm
that. It was seen in cardiovascular and skeletal muscles and cardio smooth muscles. What was it?
yeah. Well, um, cardio
Smooth
muscle,
muscle was different.
cardiovascular. Wait,
Was it
it's
cardiovascular muscle?
cardiovascular. Yeah, that's the heart.
Sounds, yeah. Okay. So it sounds weird for me right now, but whatever. Um, while it could be true that maybe some fibers or maybe some area of the muscles that have better leverage could probably be recruited first in the beginning of the movement. I think if you train to failure, I'm not sure how big of a difference that's going to make. Um, training as long as you train to failure, like if you even if you have some fibers recruited first just due to their leverages in the beginning of the movement, whether that makes a big difference or not, if you train to failure, probably not. So
Yeah, and I think that especially on a movement with an extreme amount of degrees of freedom, like a squat, it holds less validity because people can move in so many different ways that it can change the leverage. So even if the neuromechanical matching model is completely true and it just holds to be the model of what muscles are used in a movement, in a movement that has so many degrees of freedom, as you approach failure, you're going to be moving different planes, which is going to be changing the neuromechanical matching, or it's changing what muscles have the leverage. And so if you look at something like a super fixed machine movement, like a preacher curl or whatever, like it's kind of obvious what muscles are going to be working. There's not really much that your body can do to kind of move around to change to shift what muscle is actually doing the work. But in a movement like a squat, there are so many different ways that you can move left, right, up, down to get the weight up, with different muscles being used.
Yeah, and I know Andrew Vygotsky was one of the, I guess one of the people in the study that was writing in the discussion. His name's on the study paper. I talked to him about the thing, the whole neuromechanical matching model, just to see his point, and I mean, he told me that they wrote a discussion point about it, but just to go more in depth, he sent me a message. We were talking we were just talking, and he just says he's not a big fan of the name, the neuromechanical matching model, because it's just rephrasing what's been around in the biomechanical modeling literature for decades. He says it's the implicity that takes credit away from the modulars who have made these assumptions explicit in the mathematical sense. So I don't think it's that simple. That
Mm-hmm.
I know if you read an infographic, and I think that's the thing why a lot of people tend to like Chris Beardsley, which I think again I'm a really big fan of his work, because he does a really good job in grabbing a lot of complex information and summarizing it into an infographic, and again just writing it in a way that the majority of people would be able to understand, or more easier for people to understand. But people tend to extrapolate a lot of his things and then just start to make it sound like a lot of the things that he talks about are just simple, and they're not. It's just there's so much more behind it, and if you really get deep into the literature and the math and all that, you'll just be so lost in saying that, like, okay, like this is just one infographic, this doesn't explain everything that's been going on for the past, like you said, decades.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've taken any classes, in our college level classes in physiology or cell biology, I think you immediately know how complex the human body is and how little we know about it. In terms of sciences, biology is the newest out of the three big divisions of science, being physics, chemistry, biology. And we have so much more to learn about the human body that um, we just can't make a lot of conclusions because we don't know how everything interacts with everything. Now we can know on a more small scale, especially with like in vitro studies and things like that, what might happen in the body. But then again, we don't know how it affects everything globally. And that's why we can't just use in vitro studies to validate medicine, for example. Just going back on our biomedical engineering, is because we don't necessarily know how this medicine is going to affect the global system of our body, even if we know how it affects the local system that we're trying to target. And that's why we do these clinical trials, and that's why we have the FDA and all of these sorts of things. So to say that something is simple that's related to the body, it's pretty much never the case. It's never that simple.
Yeah,
So
you can't just be like, oh, well, the moment arm's bigger, so that this is going to happen. You're jumping acres through
yeah,
different topics, whether it's physiology to motor learning, and just again, there's many different assumptions from physiology to mechanics. There's like again, you're just making assumptions.
yeah. I mean, mechanics, we call them models for a reason. It's because they're simplified representations of what's actually going on. It's not you. If it was real, we wouldn't call it a model. We we would just call it real. Like I don't know. It's yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I can't really think of another limitation. I
Yeah,
don't know if you
I
want.
think we covered all of them. I think what we should do is kind of summarize a takeaway or our takeaways and what we think practical recommendations might be for people looking to oh my god, grow
Oh,
their
they're glutes.
glutes. That's a tongue twister. So I guess I'll start and then you can wrap it up. So I think pretty much what the study told us is that squats and hip thrusts as performed based off of the protocol in the study are going to produce relatively similar growth in untrained individuals. And if you're choosing one or the other, it might, and you're not an untrained individual that you can actually take sets close to failure and you're going to squat deep, it might be slightly better to do squats over hip thrusts on a set per set basis. But again, this does not tell us which is going to be better. If you have an unlimited number of sets and time available to you, it could potentially be the case that hip thrust at higher volumes and higher frequencies outperform squats at lower volumes and lower frequencies, but that is not teased out by the study. Additionally, this does not tell us that the glutes don't respond to long muscle links. In order to see that, we would like to see something like a single leg press glute bias versus a single leg hip thrust within person study design. That'll kind of tease out the difference there. And if you're just looking to overall maximize your glute hypertrophy, in my opinion, you should probably incorporate a variety of different exercises, whether that is lunges or hip thrusts or single leg press, pretty much exercises that give you a high stimulus to fatigue ratio. And I would probably bias more of your volume towards lengthened position movements just purely based off of the literature that has been coming out recently. Juan, do you have anything else to add to that?
Um, I guess, yeah, some of the takeaways for the study. I don't think it changes much in terms of the people who have already been doing squats and hip thrusts. I think it changes more so on the fact of people who have like such a strong ideology for one exercise over the other. So I don't think you should be looking at this study as a versus kind of thing, like squat versus hip thrust. You should kind of look at it as as a guide, because it really does help us look at exercise selection from a more general standpoint. And maybe it does help people saying like, well, if I haven't been doing hip thrust, have I been getting the same in a squat? And you probably could have. So I think the best takeaway from the study is that squats and hip thrust just probably elicit similar glute growth, unless we find another study going ass to grass more so. Um, Technique also matters in here. I also wanted to bring up real quick. I think the tempo for the hip thrust done in the study was it was 2 seconds eccentric going down, 0 seconds holding it in the downward phase, and then 1 second up, and then 0 seconds holding it in the top phase. So there's probably some inertia there, and some momentum could probably have skipped over that top position and the squeeze, and maybe even the hip thrust was more biased towards the lengthened position because of that eccentric. So again, form and tempo, maybe how you do the hip thrust could possibly play a role. I don't know if you want to hold it up in the top for like a second or two, if that makes a difference. So you could always play around with those things. Again, if you don't like doing hip thrust, I think, and if you like doing squats, you're probably not missing out on much. Probably, depending on your volume and all that stuff. But it might likely benefit you to add hip thrust, depending on your goal, and vice versa. If you just don't want to do squats because maybe you don't want to grow your quads and you just want to grow your glutes, you could just be getting the same out of the hip thrust, same glute growth out of the hip thrust than you would in the squat. So you don't have to feel like you have FOMO from the squat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything. Now, if anyone has any comments, we would be happy to respond to them below. And if you like this video and you want to see more, feel free to comment any ideas about what you would like us to talk about in future videos. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and share our channel with your friends so we can grow it and produce more content. Thanks again, guys.